Hey everybody, thanks for clicking on the video. I wanted to take some time to talk about another hook within React, one that I probably use the second most, just behind useState, and that is useRef. So it's another way for us to store stateful content between renders, but it is a little different than useState. It's more powerful in some ways depending on what you're using it for. If you're not familiar with useState, I do have another video that explains that. However, I'm not going to cover any useState logic here. I'm going to just jump right into an example of how to use useRef within React, why it's different than useState, and some of the things that you can do with it specifically in functional components versus class-based components. Alright, so we're going to hop into a pretty simple example. I just spun up a new React app with Create React App. So I'm on the latest version of React based on whenever this video was published. So normal caveat that if you're watching this in the future, maybe some of this stuff has changed. So I did delete some of the boilerplate. That's why I just have a blank page right now. But I'm going to go ahead and just create a brand new component. And we're going to call it timer thing, just to keep it simple. So we're going to import React from React, and we're going to create a component called timer thing. And we're going to export timer thing. And for now, let's just return a basic div with an h1. Then let's import that here. So we're going to import component slash timer thing, and we're just going to show it right here. Import timer thing from there. So if we go back to our app, all right, here's our component. Great. So let's go back here, and I just, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to add a stateful variable with useState. I'm going to call it altered text, and it has a set method, set altered text. And let's go ahead and grab useState from React here. useState. And I'm just going to put this in an h2 here. We're going to say altered text. So again, let's save it. There's foo. That's our altered text. Great. So obviously, I actually want to alter that text. Maybe when we click a button, we can say change the text. So we'll add a button that says change text, and we'll write an on-click event here. So we'll call this change text, and set altered text, and we'll say bar. So the on-click event of this button will be, I always do that, will be change text. So now if we save this, we come back, I click this, it changes. Great. So if you aren't completely familiar with useState, so anytime you call the set method within useState, it forces a re-render. So just to log this stuff, so if I had a console log here that says rendering, now console.log returns a null value by default, so by adding an or here, we can still make sure that it always returns my JSX here, but I just want to see every single time that this gets called. Let's bring our console up here. So it gets rendered once, obviously, then I click it again. Well, let's refresh, so we're in a fresh state where we have foo, we click it once, changes the bar, and it re-renders. And that's what the set state function from the useState always does. It always forces a re-render if the value has changed. So how is this different than a ref? So a ref is similar. It's, again, stateful variable. So let's say we'll call this test text, and we'll say useRef, and we'll also give it a default value. So useRef takes one argument, which is the default value that it's going to set to that. And let's just see what this looks like. So if I just console log test text here, this is all that a ref is. It is a plain JavaScript object that has one key, which is current, and that is the value that you have assigned to it. That's it. Nothing special about it. If you see current, you might think, okay, maybe it stores the previous values. It doesn't. This is all that you get. So the API for this is very, very simple. So let's actually store this in our DOM here. So test text.current. So and maybe I'll change this to the word monkey. So if I refresh this, so we get the word monkey here, and we're rendering. So the way you would change a ref would be to just say test text. So again, then our ref dot current equals, we'll say elephant. So this is how we change a value of a ref versus something like a stateful variable from useState where we get a set method. So I go here and I click change text, but nothing happens. And that is because, again, set state always forces a re-render. Use a ref variable, if we change its current value, it does not force a re-render. So it has changed, and React is aware of its new value. It just doesn't tell the DOM to update, doesn't rehydrate our page here. So you might be wondering, okay, well, why is that useful? Why would I ever want to use useRef instead of useState? Well, there are lots of times when you want to store stateful variables and not refresh the page. And a great example of that is a timer. So let's walk this back a bit. Let's actually get rid of everything we just did. And we'll just delete this stuff. So let's say I want this same functionality here, but when I click the button to change the text, I actually want to delay that. I want it to take 3 seconds for whatever reason to change that text. So you would do that like this. We'll do set timeout, and this is just basic vanilla JavaScript. Set timeout, and we'll do 2 seconds instead of 3 seconds. 3 seconds is kind of long. So now I come back, I have foo, I click this, 1, 2 seconds later, and it changes to bar. Great. But now I actually want I want the user to be able to cancel this action. I want them to be able to stop. Maybe this is like an undo method, or canceling like an API request or something where, you know, we're waiting for something to pen and report back to us. I want the user to be able to cancel this. So let's say we have const cancel timer, and we're going to bind that to the on-click of this button. So how do we actually do that? How do we actually store a timer and cancel it? Well, this is, again, very simple vanilla JavaScript, but if we have a component that might have a timer while it also has a lot of re-renders, we can't just store the timer and like let timer equals null for now, and then do timer equals this, and then clear timeout timer here, because if the state of the component ever changes, it will re-render, timer will get reset, and it will lose track of all this stuff. So this is when useRef really comes in handy. So we'll say const, we'll call it timer ref equals useRef, and we'll just say it's null by default. So here we can say timer ref.current equals that. Then if you want to cancel the timer, we'll say, well, if there is a timer ref.current, then we'll clear timeout. Again, that's just vanilla JavaScript, timer ref.current. Oops, too many parentheses there. So we'll just save that. So again, it takes 2 seconds to change the text, 1, 2, and we get bar. So if I refresh this, I click U1 and I click cancel, I've now cleared that timer and I've completely canceled the action here. It isn't very visually obvious. Let's make it a little more visually obvious. Let's add another stateful variable here. We'll call it timer is running, and set timer is running. Oops. Capital R. And this is just a Boolean. It'll be false by default. So when we get here, we're going to say set timer is running to be true. oops, gosh. I'm using my MacBook keyboard instead of my normal keyboard because my normal keyboard's too loud and I'm not quite used to typing on it. And then when the timer runs out, we'll set this to false. But also if we cancel the timer, we'll set it to false. Then we'll maybe add some style here. We'll write just some inline styles to say if timer is running, then we'll make it red. Otherwise, the text will be black. Cool. So let's go back. We'll save this. We'll say change text. See, it's red. When it switches to bar, it goes back to black. But now here it's red, and if I cancel it, it goes back to black. So we've visually shown the user now that the timer has been canceled. So this is a really good example of when a useRef is really good when you want to store something that's stateful but has no bearing on the DOM, right? So a timer is just an action that we take later that we may want to cancel. We want that to be persistent between renders, right? We don't want to lose track of how much time is being tracked. But whether it is 1 second or 3 seconds, that has no bearing on whether anything is displayed here. It's not going to re-render, so useRef makes a lot of sense there. Okay, so that's a pretty basic example, but most of the time when you use useRef, and most of the time when you see documentation that has a ref, it's related to a DOM element. So a good example of this would be something like a modal. We want a modal that's going to pop up when we click a button. So let's go ahead and just build that real quick. And we're just going to use the regular dialog tag because I'm going to keep this modal really, really simple. It has a div within it. And again, let's just give it an H1. We'll just call this our modal. So if I save that and I go back here and refresh the page, by default, the modal is not shown. You have to explicitly show it. I could do this through my console here. Showing a modal is actually part of its native API. So if I said const modal equals document.query selector, so again, just using vanilla JavaScript here, we'll just grab dialog because I know there's only one on this page, and then I can say modal dot show modal, it's a function, and there's our modal. I can do modal dot close. And there's nothing crazy special about this. This is regular APIs that just ship with your browser. Again, just vanilla JavaScript. Problem with this is that because of renders, document.query selector, that can change. I can't store that to a stateful variable, and that's when refs come in handy. We can assign a ref to a DOM element, and React makes sure that between renders, I'm always going to be consistently pointing to the same DOM element. So let's do that. Let's do const. We'll just call it. We'll call it dialog ref. useRef, and then we will say ref equals that. So now we want to add. Let's add another button that just says like open modal, and we'll write a function here called const open modal. And it will just grab that ref, dialog ref dot current dot show modal. So let's bind that action to this button. And so now we're going to have a new button here that says open modal, and when we click it, it opens our modal, and it's there. Great. I'm just going to add some basic styles to our modal here. I'm just going to say dialog with 500 pixels, height 500 pixels. Let's make it a little bit bigger so it's easier to see. There. And now it's taking up more of our screen. So let's also add a button in our modal that will hide the modal. It's const hide modal. Does the same exact stuff, but it calls the close method instead, and then we'll have a button in here. And again, I'm not going to style this stuff. I think you kind of get the point. So we close this, on click, hide modal. So now if I come here, I refresh, I can open my modal, I can click the close button. Awesome. Okay, now I actually want to add content to my modal because this is just a basic modal. It's unstyled. I want to add some stuff here. I want to add an unordered list with a bunch of content. So we'll do an unordered list. We'll just say item 1. We'll just list a bunch of items here. Item 2, item 3, item 4, item 5. So let's go back, click open modal. There's all of our items. Again, I'm not going to bother styling that for now, but I actually want to get really fancy. When I open the modal, I want this to be blank, and I want each item to animate in individually, one after the other, half a second apart, just because it's some pretty cool styling, and I want to use refs to do that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to leverage CSS to do the transitions for this. So just coming back here, we'll call it animated item has a transition of opacity of 0.5 seconds. So that's how long it takes to animate from one opacity to another opacity anytime that changes. So by default it has an opacity of 1, so we're gonna add another special class called hidden, and it has an opacity of 0. So let's add both of these classes to all of our list elements here. So let's select all of our list elements, class name equals -- hidden. I don't know why I keep forgetting that second D. So now if I go back here, you can see it's hidden by default. Okay, so now I actually want to animate these in. But again, I don't want them all to animate in at the same time. I want the animations to actually be a bit staggered. So how can we do that? I think the first thing we want to do is add another ref, and this one will be on the actual unordered list, and I can grab all of the elements that live within that unordered list. So let's create, let's call it ulref, and we will bind it to that element. Cool. So here we want to now iterate over all of our list items within this ref and animate them in one at a time. So I'm going to grab the ref .current. So again, that is the actual DOM node. And I want to grab all the list items within it. So we're going to do query selector all, excuse me, li. So you might be wondering why don't we use .children? I can actually demonstrate that. If you do ulref .children, .current.children, and .current query selector all. Just want to look at the differences here. So I click open modal, we should get both of these logged. The first, which is children, is an HTML collection. The second is a node list. So an HTML collection, if I store this as a variable here, does not have array-like methods. It does not have a for each. It does not allow me to map over them. Whereas this, a node list, again storing it as a temporary global variable, temp2, does have a for each. So node lists and HTML collections are very different. Nodes have a lot more APIs for us, and that's why we use query selector instead of just children. Just children, think of it more as just a basic list. A node list, it isn't an array, but it is more similar to an array than an HTML collection. So we're going to iterate over every single one of these via query selector all. So we'll call for each. So for each allows us to iterate over every element, and we're going to keep track of the index here because that's how we're going to do our timing. So we're going to say element.classList dot remove was animated item hidden. So we're going to remove that after half a second. So for every single one, we're going to remove it after half a second. However, because this will fire so fast, they'll still all animate in at the same time. So what we actually want to do is half a second times the index plus 1. So the first one will be 500 times 1. Oh, whoops, and I actually wrote this wrong. I meant to wrap this in a set timeout. So apologies there. This should be set timeout. This is going to fire in the set timeout. And this is where the delay happens. The second argument there, 500 times index plus 1. So again, the first one, since it's index 0, will be 500 seconds. The next one will be 1 plus 1, so 2 times 500 will be a full second. And so we're going to stagger them out like that now. So if I come here and I refresh and I click Open Modal, you see they all animate in one at a time. Awesome. So we got our cool animation with basic CSS and just a little bit of clever JavaScript there. So if I go ahead and close this modal and then I open it, well, all my elements are still there because we didn't actually hide them when the modal closed. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do something really similar. Let's actually grab this. And we are, for every single one here, we're just going to add that class. And we don't need the index here because we're not doing any sort of timing. As soon as it closes, I want to instantly hide every single element there. So I close you, and then I open, and then they all animate right back in. And I close, and I open. Seems to be working. There is one problem though, which is if I close, I open, I close, and then I open, and then I close, and then I open, and then see, the timers never actually get reset. So sometimes some of them are hidden already, sometimes some of them aren't, if I kind of quickly switch between those. So once again, I actually want to leverage a ref here to store all those timers and reset everything to a useful state when we close the modal. So let's do one more. We'll call it Modal Timers useRef, and this is going to be an array because it's going to be an array of timers for us. So when we're here, we'll say const new timers. So again, we have to store the result of this set timeout to a variable. And we'll say modal timers.current.push new timer. Then when we're here, we can say modal timers.current. Again, for each. We're writing a lot of for each methods here. And we're just going to clear that timer. So when we hide the modal, let's forget all of the stuff we were doing here. And then we're just going to make sure that all of them have this hidden class on them. So now let's refresh. I'm not sure why I keep refreshing, but I am. We're going to open the modal. We animate in. I'm going to close it. Open it again. We animate in from the beginning. Close it. And then if I let it all play out. So we solved that issue, and we did it using refs. Again, refs are really good for things like timing logic, interval logic, animations. You'll see refs used a lot in animation libraries within React, especially React Native, because they can kind of store this logic, and you can kind of isolate this logic and not worry about it being rewritten if there happens to be a re-render. So this works great, but we have a ton of logic here within one component. I'd say almost too much logic. It's a pretty big component given how trivial this example is. So let's say that this type of modal is actually going to pop up all over the place in our app, and we want to abstract it to its own component. So let's do that. Let's start. We'll just call it modal.js. Again, we'll import React from React. Or you know what, for the time being, let's actually just copy everything we have here, and then we'll just delete the stuff we don't want. We are going to have just a dialog. Let's get rid of this rendering. We need the hide modal. Open modal isn't used here. Cancel timer, that was something from the stateful variables above. And we can get rid of all of this. Okay, So the problem we run into here is that the parent component, so timer thing, we're actually going to import our component here. So import modal from modal, and we're going to replace our DOM element, our dialog here. Great, and then we can delete this function. So again, the problem here is that both the child component, so the modal itself, and the parent component, the thing that calls the modal, right, that's the thing that can actually open it, both want access to the ref. They both want access to the DOM element that is going to open the modal. However, it only lives here. So how can we make it so that both of them can access the same thing, right? Because they both have to call methods on it. This one has to call close, and this one has to call show modal. Where does that get defined? Who ultimately owns that? And how do we make sure that they both can leverage that? Well, that is when we use something called forward ref. So we're still going to assume that the parent component has the ref here, because it ultimately has to kick things off. It has to show the modal. So we are going to pass that to this. So we're going to say ref equals modal ref. Oh, let me change the name of this because it's getting me confused. So how do we actually access that ref in this component? Does it just get passed down as a prop? Well, unfortunately, no. It's not as straightforward as that. In order to access a ref that is passed down from our parent component and use it as a ref here, we have to use what's called forward ref from React. So it is not a hook, but it is a function, and it wraps our function here, forward ref. So forward ref is a function that takes a function. The function that it takes has to be a functional component. So it's going to call that functional component with its normal arguments, which is just the props, which we're not using here. And then it passes the ref that it is forwarding down to this component. So now let's actually call that dialog ref, because that's what it is. So now the parent component is passing a ref down, and then this modal component is accepting that ref by using the forward ref function so that both of them can have access to it. So this should ideally work just as it was working before. Except we're getting an error about reading query selector all on timer thing line 31. Oh, because the UL ref doesn't live there. Let's comment this out for now, because this is kind of the point I'm trying to get to, is that I don't want this component here to worry about that. Because again, this doesn't have access to the UL ref. And let's get rid of the timers. So for now, we just want to open the modal from the parent component. Open the modal. This one can close the modal. All right, so we still have this logic here. However, I want to make it so that all that timing and logic and stuff still happens when the component opens. So forward ref, again, allows us to pass a ref down, and then we're binding it to this element here, and then that makes it so the parent component can access it and the child component can access it. And that's great for most use cases. But let's say this is going to be a really dynamic modal. It's going to be very powerful, and I want to write an API for it so that other developers can use it, and it takes care internally of doing all of the little animation things for us. And all I have to call is like modal.open, and it magically opens for me. Well, we can still use refs for that, but what we can do is use a new hook called useImperativeHandle. So useImperativeHandle allows us to take a ref and create an API for it. So rather than binding this ref to the DOM element, which some would argue a parent component shouldn't necessarily have direct access to the DOM elements, right? That's something that the component itself should worry about. What we can do is we can say useImperativeRef accepts a ref as its first argument, so in this case the dialog ref. The second argument it takes is a function that it expects to return an object. Okay, so let's just start there. So what is it actually doing? It is taking this ref and it is binding it to an object. So the object being the result of this anonymous function. And that is what the parent component is going to have access to. But this object, because it's being called within this arrow function, has lexical scope within this component, this object will have access to everything within here. Sounds confusing? Well, it kind of is. So let's start by going back to this. Let's bring you back here. And let's move you above this hook. So a couple things that have to change. I still want a ref on this, right? So let's do that. Let's say const, and we'll call it dialog ref just for ease of reading, and then we'll rename this one to be something else. We'll call it public ref, and that's what we will pass to this. So we still have our dialog ref. It should work the way that it normally works. We still have our timer, our UL, but what we want to do is add a function here. Let's just call it open, and this will literally call open modal. So this function is just going to call this function, right? Because this object, again, has access to everything within this component. So we have our open method, and we're going to add a close method, and it's going to call our hide modal function. So let's save that. Now we're still going to have, let's delete that. So we still have our ref. We're passing it down here. It's getting forwarded via forward ref, and it's now being essentially bound to this object. So we should actually be able to call anything on that object. So here on the onClick event, what we're going to call now is dialog ref dot current dot open. So let's refresh. We click open. It opens our component, our modal here. I can still close it, and then if I open, I can close, open, I can close. So the benefit here is that I now have this kind of universal modal component I can use all over my app, and it has a really simple API. It says just pass me your ref, and then you can call ref.current.open, ref.current.close to close it, and I will take care of all the animation. I will take care of all the timing. All you have to worry about is this basic API that I've written for you. So useImperativeHandle is a way for us to create really simple to use components, even though they might have a ton of internal logic like timers and animations and maybe even heavy calculations and stuff. But we wanted to say, no, the component can handle all of that. It can worry about all these internal functions. It should be able to open and close easily though, and any developer who's using this should be able to look at the API and say, oh, I just click open and the modal opens. So thanks for watching. Hopefully that was informative, and you can see why useRef is so useful, not only for binding node elements from the DOM to a stateful variable, but also just storing stuff between renders when that content doesn't actually affect what is on the page itself, but you still need to keep that consistent value throughout. It was a pretty trivial example of building a modal, but I think it did demonstrate how you can still get like a really useful API out of a custom component that you used to be able to do so easily with class-based components, a little more confusing in functional components, but you can still accomplish that. If you have an example that's as simple as this, it might be a bit overkill, but hopefully this just demonstrates that if you're building something like an open source library where you're building these components, something like that can be really useful because it can make your library very easy to use. So certainly keep that in mind, but don't go crazy with it. Don't overkill. Keep it as simple as possible. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below. I'm happy to answer them. And thanks for watching.